Well, all churches at various times are bringing on various staff, leaders, and volunteers. The question is how to do so effectively. And so today on Practical Church Planting, we're going to share with you 5 pitfalls to avoid when bringing on new staff and leaders.
Well, thanks for joining us again today on Practical Church Planting. My name is Brian Androsian, and with me is Dylan Dodson. And today we're going to give you 5 pitfalls when bringing on new leaders and staff.
And this episode is brought to you by Mission Support. Mission Support knows you want to be effective in ministry, but if you're like most pastors and many ministry leaders, you probably feel like you never have enough time, energy, or expertise to get everything done. And so Ministry Support comes alongside pastors like you as a guide to provide expertise to do the things you don't know how to do and give you back the time you desperately need. So whether it's bookkeeping, SEO, payroll, websites, or any other services, you can connect with a guide at missionsupport.com. and go from feeling scattered to focused on your mission. It's possible to love being a pastor again. So again, check out missionsupport.com for more information. A lot of the administrative things that take a lot of time, but are also really needed, they can help you out. Missionsupport.com. Now, I want to say too, really quickly, if you're listening to this in real time, tomorrow, November 3rd, at 2 o'clock Eastern, I'm doing a free little webinar thing on my sermon writing process. We've done episodes on this in the past. But this will also give you the opportunity to ask questions about how to kind of create a streamlined process so you're not stressed out every week. So the easiest way to sign up for it is there'll be a link in the show notes or the Practical Church Planting Facebook group. But again, if you're listening to this real time, November 3rd, Thursday, 2 o'clock Eastern, sermon prep writing process. If you've got questions, join us.
Yes.
All right, 5 pitfalls when bringing on new leaders to staff. So this could be, obviously staff or just people in a more leadership position that are serving in your church or any capacity like that. What are some things to do to make sure that transition goes well and not well?
Not well.
So number 1 is being too accommodating. This is really a challenge, particularly in ministry. If people get maybe paid less working at the church than they were somewhere else, or if they're serving their time, you can do too much to try to make it too easy, or easy is not the right word, but like not be as upfront about the expectations and needs that you have or the church has to make sure things are done well. And so that can cause a lot of problems because you're maybe trying to, with good intentions, you're setting the bar too low to actually be able to get things done. Now, so for example of this is maybe not the best, perfect example, but I think of, here's how a practical way this worked out for us. At New City, we've got people that have raised support part-time. Brian and I, only people that are full-time. And so, earlier this year with different jobs or whatever, we were having trouble getting everyone to come to staff meeting. And what I should have done was I should have been more upfront of hey, if you're working at church, this is the expectation, and being more proactive about trying to find a time that we actually could meet. And so for a while, really until literally this week is this recording, we actually started meeting at 8 o'clock at night. Because one of the it was a Zoom thing one of the nights, which is not ideal, but still, one of the things that we found is I feel like we were all doing our jobs well, but we weren't progressing forward. And it was one of those things where you kind of felt bad being no, this is expectation that we all have to make sure we come to. You feel bad doing it, but also things aren't going to run as well. So maybe it could be a staff meeting thing. It could be an expectation. It could be, when you serve, you have to show up at this time if you're a leader, whatever it is. But the problem is if you have a need and you can be too accommodating because you feel like if you raise the bar too much, people won't want to do it. But then it can lead to problems down the road because maybe things aren't being talked about, things aren't getting done, whatever that might be for you or their situation.
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes down to just clear communication and expectations. Obviously, if you're not you have to communicate these things to people, and as long as you do it up front and there's an agreement, then you shouldn't feel bad, holding people to it or sticking to it. And the challenge is if you don't. And so I think, obviously things change, and you can't stick with the way you did things many years ago. Obviously things change and progress. But I think as long as there's an open flow of communication, then you don't have to feel like you have to bend over backwards for everything because it's kind of it's an open flow of communication. You're expressing what is kind of necessary and needed, and getting feedback as well. And so I think the challenge is you can be overly accommodating or go too far the other end and be not accommodating at all when you're not actually expressing what those expectations are. But as long as you're clear about them and people are agreeing with them, then you shouldn't feel bad about holding people to the things that they agreed upon. The challenge is if you don't tell them that ahead of time. So just be clear about your expectations with people, and then you don't need to kind of overcompensate or over-accommodate for those things because they're agreed upon ahead of time. And if it's not something that you can, that the person can do anymore or whatever, then you can have a conversation of what that looks like. And if that means that this isn't a necessarily a good fit anymore, right, or if things need to be adjusted or whatever. But just constantly like just constantly changing things to accommodate everyone else, you're just kind of I feel like you're gonna always be like chasing that thing to make everyone work.
Yep.
Like you'll always be kind of tweaking and changing things, and that just doesn't really work out well for anybody.
Yeah, so being very clear with the expectations up front, and then realizing again, we feel weird, but we feel like maybe people we don't want to ask too much of people, but we found that most people are totally fine with it. They actually are enjoying it and they want to do it. Now, again, if you're like, it's maybe a serving position and you're expecting them to give you 30 hours a week, obviously that's too much. But I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem for most of us is not being clear enough or asking enough. So whatever that is, because you want to get someone in the position, you maybe do things that you wouldn't really want to do to get someone in there, and they can cause problems down the road. So you want to set this up for success in the long term by being really clear on some of the things that you want to see happen, or maybe some of the expectations or whatever, and then making sure everybody can do those things, or making sure that person can do that thing. Otherwise, it would just be frustrated.
Yep.
Because nothing worse too, maybe having people in certain serving positions or on staff or whatever it might be, who can't do the job, and you never told them what the job was, and like everyone's just frustrated, and it's just hard. And removing people is also hard, like firing someone or telling someone they can't be in this serving position anymore. That's hard too. Yep. And a lot of it could just be, changed. It's just up front. You're just very clear on what was needed. If they can't do some of those things, it's not going to work. This is a little bit different, but I lead like a discipleship group every Tuesday morning with a group of guys here at New City. And I was very clear, like, here's what this is going to look like. It's going to be 9 months. You got to show up every week, whatever. Because if you miss a week, someone else might think, well, they're not here every week. So because we're memorizing scripture, we're doing these things together. And so I emailed a couple of guys. And what's interesting is I've mentioned this before. I tried to do like a men's Bible study that didn't go anywhere. It was like, come whenever you want. And then I did this thing, and I only emailed a handful of people, and they were all like, yes, or they really wanted to do it, but they couldn't. But the bar was a lot higher. And one person was like, hey, I can't come every week, but I can come most weeks, just depending on my schedule. And typically you'd be like, oh, that's totally fine. But for what I was doing, it wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have been good for the rest of the group for this person to be consistent. And plus, people get sick or they go on vacation every once in a while too.
Right.
So then you have not just work's calling me out, but then I've got other things calling me out. It was a problem. And so if I had been to it accommodating, it would have felt better, but it would have been to the detriment of the group. And it was a lot better that, at least in this season, it's not that, the person can't do it because the job wouldn't let them, which is not their fault. So I know that's not necessarily a serve position, but just be very clear what you need. Otherwise, you'll just run into a lot of problems. And trying to change it after the fact is really difficult too.
Yeah, for sure.
So being too accommodating, be clear on what you need. If they can't make it or do it for whatever reasons, even if they're good, I would just wait and try to find someone else than trying to change everything around and then get really frustrated later on.
Yep.
Number 2 is not asking the uncomfortable but needed questions. Now, this is more so depending on what the role is, and particularly, especially if they're coming on staff, just talking to people and having, things come up about personal life or thoughts or views on things that weren't known before this person was hired, for example. And then it caused a lot of problems where if you just had asked questions, it would have been better. And so again, it's different for different positions, and you got to be respectful and kind. Maybe some of these questions need to be the appropriate gender is asking for people. So but if we're hiring, if we were to hire a guy on staff, we're going through some transitions here at New City Church. Like any guy that I hire for these roles, I will be asking, are you looking at porn? Because if someone's addicted to pornography, working on a church staff, it wasn't discussed, it's going to come up at some point.
Yeah.
Another thing is like theological views. Not that everyone has to be like 100% in lockstep. You have to agree no matter what. But if your church, faithful Christians can disagree on various issues. And it's not like whether you're a Christian, it's just we disagree. Yeah. And so if your church holds certain positions, like we have, a bunch of secondary positions like everyone does that we teach, but if you're on staff and you would disagree with all of them, it's probably going to be uncomfortable at some point. Now, if there's one or two things, it's not the end of the world. Like it's fine. But if there's like something significant that your church does, like for example, I don't know, maybe you don't do infant baptism, like believe in baptism only. You have someone on staff, maybe you're hiring them for a pastoral role, and they're really like, no, you have to do infant baptism. Like that could be a problem at some point. Especially if it's something like they're really, really passionate about. And so asking the uncomfortable but needed questions, again, it varies depending on the role, but not being afraid to ask, whatever it might be, to make sure that this is a good fit. If you're just like hoping things are okay, or if you assume things are okay, that's where I hear a lot of these problems with some of the church planners I talk to or the assessments I do with Acts 29. Yeah. It's just like they just assumed, they didn't ask, and then things came up, and it was like, I can't believe we never asked about what this is. So,
yeah, and like I think it's good to ask the questions, and you can kind of weight how much weight, I guess, you want to give things. Like you're talking about all the secondary views. And I think it's good. It's not necessarily like if they disagree with one, then they're just out.
Right.
But it's helpful for you to know that, like here, and maybe do the same thing. We do like a message collaboration with, a few of us every week. And it would be helpful to know if we're if we're coming up on one, if I really disagreed with Dylan or with the church on, a stance that's going to be preached on. And it might not be like, okay, you can't work here kind of thing, but it would just be helpful to know going in that these are things, and not having something come up later that all of a sudden I'm like really digging my heels in the sand and, really like staunch about, and we never even discussed it before. And it's like, wait a minute. I thought we were like kind of in lockstep with all these things.
Yeah.
And so it's help. And you can kind of decide how much weight to give things. Obviously some like moral issues, they should hold a lot of weight, but like some of these things you can decide if it means you can or can't work here, or it means, hey, you can work here, but you need to know this is what it's going to be. And we need to make sure that we can disagree, but also we need to not be dividing the church among this. Like, it's not like you need to lie and say that this is what you believe, but we need to make sure that we're not going to be like preaching different things or teaching different things to people, because that's going to cause a lot of confusion. And so I think a lot of these tough questions or uncomfortable questions are just good to know about people. And I think earlier on, I did this a lot. Like early in church hiring days of New City, we didn't have much money, and people were raising support.
You showed up. It's like, sure, here you go.
Right. Well, kind of, and like we live and learn, and that's kind of why we're doing this. Is like we made a lot of mistakes, and some of them worked out anyways. But like I feel like earlier on we didn't really think about it, or we just needed people, and so it was like, I don't want to say like if you wanted to work, you could work, but like that wasn't literally the case. But sometimes we almost treated it like that. But and for the most part, it's worked out fine. It's not like we really got into a ton of trouble. But I think,
I would say God was kind to us, because other people's stories were different.
I definitely agree.
We were just fortunate that it wasn't a problem, because we didn't ask.
yeah, exactly. And I think it's if you can't pay much, or if you're asking people to raise support, sometimes you feel guilty.
Yeah.
Like. Almost like weeding people out, so to speak. But at the end of the day, this does need to be a job. And obviously, it's different questions you would ask here than in like a job in the marketplace. But there'd still be interview questions and questions of how you'd handle certain things, and kind of more uncomfortable questions that just need to be tweaked a little bit to be appropriate for church. But that we wouldn't really feel weird asking questions anywhere else, but sometimes in church, because we can't pay much, or we sometimes feel like people are doing us a favor, raising support, that we're uncomfortable asking questions. But it's healthier for everyone, them and them too, if we can ask these questions up front.
Like another example, so my wife leads an online marriage ministry called Awesome Marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Like a ton of free resources, awesomemarriage.com. Check it out. It's great.
Yeah.
But they had a person that was doing something that, I don't know, it was like 8 or 10 of them, so I don't know what they all do. And we figured out after a while, because this person also came to our church, that they did not believe in what we would think is a biblical definition of sexuality, of marriage between a man and a woman. So we teach in New City. It's what Awesome Marriage teaches. It's a Christian ministry.
Right.
They did not hold to that. And, she was like, I never asked.
Yeah.
I just assumed. And it was fine for a while. But even after a while, the employee was like, no, it's fine. Like, I obviously disagree with some of this content that we create, but like, I can still do my job. And it just put them in a really awkward, uncomfortable position.
Yeah.
Because they didn't want someone to feel uncomfortable or to do something they didn't agree with. And obviously, they want people to Awesome Marriage. What is marriage is a very important, it's a marriage ministry. It's important. And so they didn't ask. And so now, as they bring more people on, it's like, what they asked this question that they assumed, it's like a Christian thing. And so again, for staff, that might even be a great question, especially in our culture today. What do you think about marriage or sexuality or any of these things that can be really divisive and really important to your church or your ministry that you just assume, well, everyone thinks the same thing. You gotta be willing to ask those questions so you don't run into problems later on.
And that's a really good point, because like in that example, they, the ministry, they talk about it. And so I think you just assume no one would apply for this job if they really disagreed with it, or no one would be interested in it. And we could probably do that with churches a lot too. Like we do church this certain way or whatever, and you really wouldn't want to work here if you want to do things a different way. But that's not always the case. And so it's helpful to ask those questions that you might assume, but I don't know, I think you might run into some surprising answers if you actually want to ask them.
Yep. So not asking the uncomfortable but needed questions. And again, the larger the role, particularly if it's a staff role, you got to make sure you ask them.
Yeah, for sure.
Number 3, inconsistent follow-up. So it can be really difficult. You bring someone on, but you haven't set the expectation of here's how often we're going to review what's going on. And so what typically will happen is you don't really, you talk about things, but you don't really have like a conversation about things unless there's a problem.
Yeah.
And so anytime you say, hey, we need to talk, it's like, oh, I did something wrong. So we always recommend having some sort of already set up consistent follow up or conversations that you just schedule so that it's not awkward if there's a problem.
Yeah.
So, like for us, for example, I mean, this might be different as we bring different staff on, but like right now, I meet with each of the staff once a month. And so if there's a problem, like it's not like, hey, I need to talk to you. It's like, we already have it scheduled. It's not this awkward thing.
Right.
It's kind of the expectation that we're going to talk about how things are going. So it's not even like, even if things are going good, we're still going to talk about it, which makes it really makes it a lot better too. Because what often happens is not so much that people do something, they mess up really big, but there's like a small thing here or there that's like off or that bugs you a little bit or that should be addressed, but you feel bad because you don't want to make a big deal out of it.
Yeah.
But because you haven't set up any sort of consistent area of feedback and like set the expectation that we're going to talk about stuff every so often, it's hard to bring it up because it feels like you're making a big deal. Something that's not a big deal, but you just didn't have a regularly scheduled with them to talk about it. So inconsistent follow-up is a big thing. Anytime you're bringing on a staff or someone who's leading a position, I would go ahead and set up, say, hey, every blank, every week, every other week, every month, whatever, we're going to talk about just everything going on so that it makes even this really small things, you can address it without it being awkward.
Yeah, and I think if you don't do this, then a lot of the small things just will end up going unaddressed, because it can be, I think you can start weighing like, is this even worth having a meeting over, or are they going to feel like I'm attacking them or something like that? If I'm kind of, or like I'm nitpicking, so to speak, if I just bring up these small things and that's the only reason we're meeting, and especially if you have like, I mean, I think in most cases you probably won't have everyone having the exact same work schedule if you have part-timers and stuff, and then it can be like, do I need to actually schedule something on the calendar to bring up this little thing, and then that is really awkward, and they're going to think I'm like mad or something. And there can be all this list of things, but if you just have a plan of we're going to meet every so often or every X whatever it is, and we're going to talk about these things, and you can just have this list, and it should be, and it should be like good and bad, obviously, unless things are like going terrible or things are going wonderful, but like you probably should have good, and I think everyone will have good or positive and negative is a better way to put it, things to talk about. And then you can bring up all those little things, and it's not a big deal. But if you're trying to just like every time something comes up, trying to grab them or trying to schedule something or whatever, then it's going to be frustrating on your end and on their end, because they're going to feel like they have no breathing room, and you're going to feel like you're constantly breathing down their neck, and it's going to be tough.
So inconsistent follow-up, the best way to do this is just to set it up front. Here's how we're going to talk. Because again, it's really hard if it's a volunteer or someone who works very part-time and you're not even seeing each other very often except on Sunday. It's like, emailing them, hey, we need to talk over something that's really small. It feels weird, so just don't do it, and then things don't get addressed, and then it's just not good.
And I would say do it even if you feel like you don't have much to like.
Right.
Like don't just skip them until you have something.
Right.
Don't be like, oh, let's not bother this week, or this month. Just do it and come up with something. And even if it's short, it's better to just have something to meet with than to just kind of push it off until there's something serious.
Yeah, because on the other end too, there's a good chance that they have questions or ideas.
Yeah.
And if there's not like an organic place to talk about them, they might feel weird, like, hey, I want to ask about this one small thing. And so they don't do it either.
True. So
it's just a lot easier for all parties involved to have consistent follow-up. So it's a big pitfall. I would set up on the front end. Or again, if you're leading a staff or a serve team or volunteers right now and you're feeling some of this tension of like there's problems, I would go ahead and say, going forward, here's how often, we're setting this thing, just trying to make sure we're on the same page and set something in place, for everybody so that it's not awkward when you have to talk about it.
Yep.
So inconsistent follow-up number 3 is a pitfall. Number 4, being clear on what will not change. So if you're not honest up front about here's what we're doing, here are the things that are not changed, if you're not clear about that, then that can cause problems because they might want to change things that you're not going to change.
Yeah.
So again, this goes to not asking the right questions. So like theologically, there are certain things that they're not going to change about what our church teaches. And if it's a really big deal, like that's not going to work. Or like for us, so we're trying to start a student ministry, middle school and high school. We don't really have students really, so it's kind of like the chicken or the egg thing.
Yeah.
So trying to figure this out. But one of the things that's important for me, for example, is that for us as we grow and as this thing gets developed, it's important for me that middle and high schoolers be in the service on Sunday mornings. So we have our kids ministry, New City Kids. The kids are in there. But as we're getting older, I'm like, listen, if they can sit in an algebra class for 90 minutes, they can listen to someone teach the Bible for 30.
For sure.
And a lot of these problems and questions that people get, as they go to college, it's like, well, they weren't in an adult, multi-generational environment. So if we had someone that said, no, I want, once we get this thing figured out, middle schoolers are going to have their own thing during the service. To me, that would be a non-starter. Now, our building doesn't even have the space to do much of things. So, but again, who knows what could happen in the future? Like, if we had someone that was like, hey, I'm really passionate about this age group, here's what I want to do, and they were like, this is going to happen, or if they thought, well, eventually, that would be a problem. So I'm like very clear, like it's important for me that they're in there. And so that could be being clear on what will not change. So again, with your have people schedule volunteers or whatever. Obviously, you want to give people a lot of freedom to do the things that they want to do. But if there are certain things that are what they are, you want to be very clear on those so there's not problems later on.
Yeah, and you can be clear in a. I guess how do I put this? One thing I think we've done well, or I guess Dylan has done well, is we have these things, but there's not. It's not like this insane list of things. In other words, people have and like volunteers that come on or staff have a lot of freedom to make a lot of decisions and do things different ways. In other words, it's not like when we started a new city, Dylan is like every ministry has to look this certain way, and every hill I'm going to die on. That kind of thing. But there are certain things, obviously, we want some things done a certain way, but also there's a lot of freedom in there too. So, like, I think you can take this too far to one extreme or too far to the other, where you need to find that balance where there needs to be things that if you're passionate about it and you really want it done a certain way and you feel like you have reasons for it, then be honest about that. Because if you're not and you just let people do it, you're going to be, and it doesn't work out, you might be bitter about it, or you might feel that like you should have said something. But also you can take it too far to the other way and you feel like you have the perfect way to do everything, in which case people are going to feel like, I don't have any freedom here to make any decisions. I'm just kind of executing your will kind of thing. And so you need to find that middle ground of what things are really important to you. Obviously, theological issues, probably most of them are going to be, fall into this. You're probably not going to, at least it's going to take probably a lot to like make changes in beliefs of the church. But like when it comes to how things are run, if you have things that you want done a certain way, that's fine. But be willing to take advice on things that you aren't as passionate about. In other words, like don't feel like you have to have a concrete decision for every single thing, but the ones you do, be clear about, and you don't need to apologize for them if you feel like you have a good reason that you feel like things should be done a certain way.
Yep. So be clear on what will not change as you're bringing people on.
Yep.
And last but not least, number 5, encourage their feedback and input. So again, you might think you want feedback and input, and you might think anyone can say anything, but if you're the leader, particularly the longer the church has been around and or the older you are, it's harder for people to kind of share their thoughts and opinions. Again, you might think, well, I want to hear it, but unless you're actually articulating, like, tell me what you want, and maybe even asking, what do you think about this? It's going to take a while for someone new who's coming on. For some people, maybe not, and for some of you probably thinking, no, I've got someone who won't ever stop. But that is the exception. Most people, they want to be respectful. They want to make sure they're doing things the right way. Especially if they're new or they have ideas, or if maybe they've been for your church a while, but you're new bringing them on. Like there's probably stuff they want to try that would be really, really great, but there's an intimidation factor for them to say anything. You want to you want to say this multiple times, but I think you also, whether it's in staff meetings or these one-on-one things or whatever, ask them, what they have thoughts on. Or if it's like if you're in a smaller church staff, you might have someone who's doing a specific role, but you want to be clear. If you have opinions on anything, like let us know. And saying that a couple times, especially if they still haven't shared their thoughts, but be really, really encouraging on their feedback and input, because the chances are you really want it, and you assume people will just tell me, but that they won't. And I know it kind of feels weird, again, especially if you're the leader or you're in leadership, because you don't have a problem sharing what you think, but that's not the case for newer people that are coming on, particularly if you're more established or if you're a lot older than them. It'd be really, really difficult. So encourage their feedback and input, or else you probably won't get it.
And I think it's helpful to, especially if you've already launched and you're bringing someone on to maybe take over a role or something like that, maybe you don't have to necessarily say this verbatim, but kind of my thought process is if you've been here for, if we had a position for a while, like we're going through some transitions right now, and someone is replacing somebody else, if months down the road the position looks the exact same, then I don't really want that. Like I want you to have ideas, and that's we have someone our kids lead is transitioning out, and we have a new one coming in. And I told her, like, I would rather hear your really bad ideas. Like, I would rather you come up with ideas, them not work, and us try them and they don't work, than just to say, we're just going to keep doing it the way it does and not take any risks, because that's the way that things change and that's the way we make things move. Obviously, if she wants to do something that we've tried and it doesn't work, then we'll lend her that wisdom and let her know, like, hey, we tried this doesn't work for whatever reasons. But with a new person, I would so much rather them come in with ideas and us try them, and maybe some work, maybe some don't, than to just come in and just kind of keep things status quo and keep doing things the way they've always been done. Just because that doesn't really get us anywhere. Yep. But people don't. Not everyone knows that they can do that. Like especially if you're younger, especially if you've been around for a while, it can be intimidating to come in and like actually want to make changes, especially if things aren't necessarily like broken. Yeah. Like if you're not hired to fix something, but if something's going, then you need to let them know, like, hey, I almost want you to break it, and like I want you to come up with ideas that might not be good, because that's how we're going to get to the good ideas.
Yeah, because the challenge is people do things how they do things, and they're not necessarily right or wrong. It's just how they did it. So when you have someone new coming in who might want to do things different, they might feel like, oh, if I change something, it's bad, or it's an indictment on the previous person.
Yeah, true.
Which
Right.
is that's why you got to be clear about these things. Like it's not. And also, if the leader, whether it's a staff person, volunteer, whatever, if the leader who's leading something is not excited about something, it's not going to be as good. It just, even if the
Yeah.
previous person had something really awesome that everybody liked, if the new leader's like, it's not them for whatever reason. It would, over the long term, it would be worse to continue to do that really good thing, because if you're not excited about it as a leader, people can pick up on that and they can tell.
Yeah.
I guess a side note to this is fun to me. So the Bible Project, it's a great podcast, and many of you might be familiar with it. So Tim Mackey and I forget the other guy,
John Collins.
John Collins. Tim Mackey's like the Bible nerd, and John Collins is like the artistic guy, whatever. But they also do a weekly podcast, all other things.
Yep.
And it's so interesting listening to this. I think it's a great example. Like Tim is such a nerd, and he gets so excited. Like you listen to the podcast, he's like so excited about this like super obscure thing,
Yeah.
and I'm like listening. I'm like, this is awesome. Or like this,
Right,
the
yeah.
same exact information could be shared by someone else, and I would be like, oh, that's cool. But I wouldn't be as moved by it, nor would I remember it as much. But
Yeah.
his passion for it, this like nerdy, geeky passion
That's a
for
really
it,
good
just
point,
makes
yeah.
everyone like, this is great. And I think it's part of the reason why the podcast and all the stuff they do is really, really good. And so it's just encouraging people, if they have ideas of things to try, obviously certain things you're not going to change, making sure it's in the bounds and give feedback, that sort of thing. But they've got to be excited about it, and they have to be encouraged to know that it is okay to change things. Otherwise, for various reasons, they won't, because they think it's wrong, they don't want to upset somebody or whatever. So you've got to be, really encouraging up front to ask questions, get their input, let them do things. If you just assume they're going to do it, they probably won't.
Yeah. Very true.
So those are 5 pitfalls when bringing on new leaders and staff: being too accommodating, not asking the uncomfortable but needed questions, having inconsistent follow-up, not being clear on what will not change, and encouraging their feedback and important. If you don't do that, you have problems.
Yep.
So hope that was helpful. Again, if you want to check out missionsupport.com for helping you get a lot of your tasks done so you can focus on the work of ministry. And if you want to join in on the preaching webinar, super laid back, just talking through, asking your questions. Again, there's a link in the show notes, as well as the Practical Church Planning Facebook group.
Yep.
We're almost at 2,000 people. So
Yeah.
if you're there. Also, as we're recording this, you know what I just remembered?
What's that?
This is our 300th episode.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I know that just because it's on our spreadsheet. We don't have
happy 300.
anything
No, we
to
don't.
celebrate
Oh,
this
my
time.
gosh.
But 300 episodes in.
Yeah, that's crazy.
That is
That
crazy.
is really crazy.
So-
Oh, thank you for 300 episodes.
300 episodes. So
Yeah.
practicalplanting.com, a lot of free resources there, and we will be with you next week on Practical Church Planting.